Welcome, everyone, to what promises to be a fascinating discussion of how the energy chains of Europe and Eurasia are connected to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and how the war is being shaped by those connections and also reshaping them as well. I am delighted to introduce Margarita Balmaceda, who is one of the leading experts in the United States and indeed in the world on energy questions in Eurasia. She is a professor at Seton Hall, and we are also very proud to have her as a member of the Davis Center community for many years. She's contributed so much intellectual breadth and substantive knowledge to our community, and so I'm grateful that she's willing to share some thoughts about her new book. Here it is, Russian Energy Chains. And I believe that she's also planning to make some connections to what's going on over the past month or so in Ukraine as well. So, Margarita, it's such a great pleasure to have you with us today. Tell us what's on your mind. Tell us what's in your book and how it relates to what's going on in this horrible war that is still underway.
Well, thank you so much, Rawi. And it is me who is thankful to the Davis Center. I have gotten so much inspiration, not only from your work on energy at very different levels, but also so many chapters, drafts of chapters, things that never became chapters of this book were presented at the workshop on post-communist politics and economics at the Davis Center. Great feedback from PhD students, postdocs, faculty, and I'm without this, I would not have been able to get to this book. So what I would like to do is spend about 20 minutes or so telling you a little bit about the key things I tried to do with this book, how I got there, how some of the key findings of the book help us understand the current situation. And then I hope we can have a bit of a discussion and questions. I'm sure there are many, many different topics that are in your mind and in our minds, in Rawi's mind and my mind as well. So let me try to share my screen and let's see how technology is helpful or not helpful in this point. Okay, am I okay? Yes. So let me start by telling you how I got here, how I got to this book. And for those of you who may know me, and maybe this is nothing new, but for some of those who are new to this discussion, maybe it is. So for many, for many years, there was the discussion about Russia's energy weapon. And that phrase is not new to us. In fact, that phrase takes a new meaning now. However, in my own life, the way in which that phrase was used in a rather indiscriminate manner made me very uneasy. And this is how I got started, basically, on the energy research area, because I was unhappy about the undifferentiated way in which this discussion of energy weapon was taking place. So I started to work on this, and I kind of focused myself on trying to understand the black box between the supplier and the energy dependent state, be it Ukraine, be it other energy dependent states. And maybe I overdid it because I ended up writing 3 books about this. In these books, I focus on winners and losers of different ways of organizing those energy relations with Russia. I dealt a lot with corruption, whether energy policy had been hijacked. So one of these books dealt only with energy corruption in Ukraine. Fortunately, nobody apparently in the Ukrainian government at that time read it, because I wouldn't have been alive if they had read this book. I wrote another book, a very bigger book, where I compared Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian energy policies. And although originally trying to understand how politics affected energy policy, I ended up finding out that the way energy policy was dealt with had a feedback effect and affected the political system. I wrote another book on Belarus and on how energy refining and oil refining and the use of some of the under the radar elements of energy relations allowed Lukashenko to have a certain relationship with Russia. This is very important, again, as Belarus takes a larger role in this crisis, and as the energy relationship between Belarus and Russia takes a different shade. And in all this work, I I think I got a sense of what that black box was. I looked a lot at the issue of corruption and governance. But what I ended up understanding after all that work is that the issue of governance and corruption was not unveiling the entire story. Because even if we had taken away corruption, which of course in many cases was very difficult to take away from the picture, there was still a very deeply ambiguous set of attitudes towards participation in Russian export chains. Yes, corruption was a very important part of the story, but there was a tension between trying to diversify. Even countries like Lithuania, which went the farthest in trying to diversify, had that tension, yes, trying to diversify, but still trying to strengthen the country's role in the value added chain of Russia's exports. So if I start the book with Ukraine and Nord Stream 2, and how Ukraine, even when opposing Nord Stream 2, still wanted very strongly to remain part of Russia's energy export chain through the Brotherhood pipeline. And even today, as we speak, even as the Ukrainian government officially is trying to rally European states to totally move away from imports of Russian oil and gas, because these imports are filling the Russian war chest, even as Ukraine officially is doing this, Ukraine is also pulling an incredible balancing act in keeping alive and well transit through those natural gas pipelines, which is incredible. And again, tells us that about that tension between wanting perhaps to diversify, but also wanting to be part of those chains. Why? Because being part of those chains gave some economic benefits. Perhaps that's the top of the iceberg, transit fees. In the case of Ukraine, $2 billion per year. But it also has another other sides. One is the technical side. For example, in the case of natural gas, because of the technical way in which natural gas works, which I'll get to in a moment, having that transit role really gives you an anchor for your entire natural gas system. But also, in the case of Ukraine, especially after the failure of the Budapest agreements of 1994 to give any real security guarantee for Ukraine, being an important transit player really was seen as an anchor in triangulating its relationship with Russia, not being left alone in that relationship with Russia. So understanding this, I got into working on this book. Originally, it had a different title, Chains of Value, Chains of Power. That's also the title in my Davis Center associate application. Unfortunately or fortunately, Columbia University Press wanted me to change the title, so it's Russian Energy Chains, and I think it's also fine. So what I try to do in this book is to look at that balance, at that tension between the threat of participation in those Russian energy chains and the temptation, the opportunity. And to do that, I try to look at the entire value chain, not simply at how much natural gas or how much oil you import, but at the entire chain. And to do that, of course, you have to go upstream, midstream, downstream. As it happens, upstream is in mainly in Western Siberia, and downstream in Ukraine, in other states that engage in transit, and also in the processing of Russian energy, and downstream end consumers. In my book, I take the end of my chains to end in Germany. This is really important because even when you have EU energy policy, there is still a lot of tension between national level and EU level energy policy. So it was very important that we had the same country. And I had to work a lot trying to find those chains that would all end in Germany. So my three chains that I follow in this book are a natural gas chain going from Urengoy in northern Western Siberia to the Franken 2 power plant in Bavaria, the oil chain going from Batyagonske in the Hanzimanskisk Republic to a gas station or petrol station in Dresden as diesel, and my coal chain, which starts in southern Western Siberia, goes through Ukraine and then through a unique side story ends up in Germany. I'm not going to tell you that side story in this presentation. It's a very interesting story about Ukrainian oligarchs, EU regulations, dumping, and Italian pop and mom firms. Let's leave that for some other event. But the important point is that these three chains all end in Germany. And the questions I try to answer in this book are both empirical and theoretical. So empirically, I try to understand how has participation in those Russian export chains affected power relationships. Here, I use power not only to mean power over, that is like Russia's power over another state, but also power to, the power of different energy actors to be powerful within their polities. I try to understand how this had a historical role. And in terms of theory, which was the question that originally moved me, I try to understand how do the different characteristics of different types of energy, different energy goods, affect power relations. So I knew that whether you are natural gas or you are oil will affect how you can be transported, maybe how an external actor can use it, but I wanted to look also at how it affected domestic power relations, and that's another level of the book that is there. So in the book, as it finally emerged after 7 years of work, I tried to make it work at different levels. So I have a very serious academic level with that theoretical question, which I seek to answer, but I also try to make it readable for other people. So the way the book is built is as a travelogue of 3 molecules that are going from Siberia to Germany: the oil molecule, the natural gas molecule, the coal molecule, and what happens to these molecules on the way, and how looking at this travelogue sheds light on those historical relationships and how that threat and temptation plays out. I also try to make the book useful for students by having several appendixes where I explain all the technology that is involved and all the technology-related items, names, dates that are discussed in the book. And beyond students, I try to make the book something that can help common readers understand the technology that is essential for understanding these power relationships. We have discussed a lot about the Russian energy weapon without really discussing technology. And in this book, I trust the reader to, with a little bit of help, be able to master those concepts so that he or she can use them going forward as well to understand how that all comes together for understanding power. So the whole idea of threat and temptation is a key guiding element in the book. I'll get back to that in a moment after I go through some other concepts. But the point here is that even when I start and end with Ukraine, this tension is not unique to Ukraine. We have seen that in other former Soviet states and certainly in European Union states, for example, through the way in which European Union business actors were very happy with the high promised profits of Nord Stream 2, through the entire story of very profitable joint ventures with Russian companies, and of course, through the issue of the export of energy technology, which was essential for Russian companies to be able to tap into more difficult to exploit fields in Eastern Siberia, in Sakhalin, in the Arctic. If you remember Thane Gustafsson's book, Wheel of Fortune, he refers to the to this as the brownfield. I mean, not only him, but in general, he talks a lot about how these older fields need to be replaced by new fields. He talks about the white, the brown, the green, and the white areas in the white fields in the Arctic. And to be able to exploit that, you need technology, and a lot of that technology was coming from Western companies, which all tied into the question of threat and temptation. So let me move to highlighting a few concepts which are really important in this book which will also help us understand the current crisis. So I am not following the book by chapter in any way. I'm simply giving you a couple of concepts which will be important for understanding the situation now as well. So the first concept is materiality. That was the theoretical question that moved me, understanding how that materiality affected power relations. And basically here I'm looking at the physical characteristics of different energy goods. In the case of this book, natural gas, oil, and coal, and how it affects power relations. So in the case of natural gas, being a gas makes all the difference, in particular because the enterprise of moving gas, working with gas, marketing gas is all related to the issue of managing pressure in the pipeline. And this is going to have a whole set of issues related to it, having to do with how large of a market you can have. If you are mainly transporting natural gas through pipelines, that limits your markets, that limits whether you can have global prices, that in turn affects transparency, affects corruption. And if we get to the situation today, it helps us explain both the limitations of the European Union players as they seek to finally move away from Russian natural gas. One key alternative that has been discussed is liquefied natural gas, and the US has just made a very strong commitment to supplying that liquefied natural gas, but there are technological constraints on receiving that liquefied natural gas. Not only is there an issue of there not being sufficient terminals for receiving this liquefied natural gas, but there are technological constraints having to do with the energy that you need, for example, to transform that liquefied natural gas back into regular gas. But issues of transportation and of pressure management also help us look with a different perspective on Russia's argument that if European Union states will not purchase this natural gas, or if European Union states will not pay for this natural gas in rubles or in whatever form Gazprom would want now, they will shift to Chinese markets. That's not so simple. So understanding the materiality of natural gas is really important here. Understanding the materiality of natural gas is also really important for understanding why Ukraine was and continues to be key for that entire Western European natural gas market. In the picture here is a map that I have on page 99 of the book. It's a kind of modernist view of the natural gas infrastructure in Western Ukraine. What is important here is that Ukraine played and plays still a key element, key role, not only in transit as a whole, but exactly in managing pressure because of the denseness of the infrastructure, because of Ukraine's unique underground natural gas storage facilities, which you see here in this map as well. And that is going to be very important both in understanding Ukraine's role vis-a-vis supplies in Europe as a whole, but also why it was important for Ukraine to maintain that role in energy transit. In the case of oil, the key element here is price swings. And that is so important, price swings, and also the way in which different segments of the oil market interplay, different segments, both in terms of the different oil products that you produce with crude oil. For example, in my book, the oil product that gets to my end consumer in Dresden is not gasoline, but diesel, which has a kind of a separate story. And lo and behold, today diesel is going to be the largest problem in terms of supply to Western Europe. So you have that fragmentation of the market. You also have a fragmentation of the market concerning the valuation of different brands of oil. Most of you are familiar with Brent. Most of you are familiar with the way in which the global quotation for Brent has skyrocketed in the last weeks, but we also have very interesting things happening right now with Russia's flagship export, Urals, or also known as REPCO, but even with types of oil many of us had never heard about, such as Sokol oil from Sakhalin, which is also selling now at a very big discount versus Brent, and is being taken by some consumers which normally would have never even thought of touching that oil, such as India. So the way in which the book focuses our attention on those price swings and of the way in which the oil market is comprised of discrete but interrelated markets, it's really, really important for understanding what can be done today concerning sanctions, whether those sanctions can really be effective or not, how other players may try to actually take advantage of some of the increased differentials between those different types of oil in a way that supports their economies, but may also undermine sanctions. And concerning coal, this is actually, I would say, the most interesting part of the book, the most interesting chapter of the book, the most difficult chapter of the book to write. In this book, I focus on the coal, steel, energy industrial chain. And coal has not been in our discussion concerning sanctions and concerning the current crisis. It is, however, really important for understanding how we got to this crisis from the Ukrainian side, especially prior to 2014. It's really important for understanding the role of Ukrainian oligarchs. And it's really important for understanding how direct energy discussions interface with industrial discussions. Russia continues to export coal in large amounts. Russia just recently signed very significant agreements for the sale of, I believe, 100 million tons of coal to China. That side of the dependency is not going away, even as we speak of cutting off imports of Russian natural gas and oil. In many cases, Western European power plants are moving from Russian natural gas to Russian coal, for example. Second key concept that I highlight in this book is the idea of understanding the entire value chain. And by this, of course, I'm not referring only to understanding the entire supply chain from Siberia to Germany, but specifically looking at value chains as separate from supply chains, or as a better understanding of those chains. Because here we need to look not only at the physical supply of the good, which is very important and certainly is key for understanding how technology and materiality play a role, but looking at the value aspect, at the swings in valuation is really important for understanding those relationships, and obviously is really important today as we, for example, look at what is happening with Russian oil and how those different valuations for oil and for oil products are developing. Third key concept is the idea of energy political systems, the idea that energy creates not only electricity or fuel for transportation, but entire social political systems. I use this a lot when I discuss the case of Donetsk, Donbass, and coal, but it's also key for understanding Russia's situation today and how the sanctions may affect Russia, because energy and energy exports for Russia are not simply a technical issue, are a way of maintaining not only systems of social provisioning, but also currency for bargains between different interest groups, not only oligarchs, but also the power ministries and the so-called siloviki. Fourth key concept is the impact of contractual nodes and contracts. Many of us get really bored when we have to look at a contract with a fine with print, or we have to use a lot of extra aids to understand the contract. But it's really, really important for understanding the situation now, because when you're looking at the issue of whether countries will divest from Russia, whether countries can move away from those contracts for import that they had signed, whether they will pay in rubles or not. Contracts are really important. And also, even institutions we, as the international community, have created to support energy security, such as the Energy Charter Treaty, those institutions, those international governance frameworks also have a particular take on contracts, which may actually make it difficult to move away from some of the contractual obligations or from fossil fuel-based energy trade and energy systems because of the whole problem with sunk costs. Some of you may be familiar with the whole issue of the so-called need for modernization of the Energy Charter Treaty. This need for modernization is related to the fact that the way that Energy Charter Treaty is written now, it's making it very difficult to move away from coal because it would bring in the whole issue of sunk costs. So these are very important issues which have kind of remained under the radar, but are going to be essential for understanding the impact on sanctions. And finally, the last concept I want to highlight, which is basically the first concept that moved the book, is the idea of threat and temptation in participation in those energy chains. And if we look at the European side, at the side having to do with European players, we really see this as really essential for helping us understand how we got here, how we got to 2022, how we got to Russia's decision to enter into a large-scale, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Part of this has to do with the way in which European business players at many different levels saw collaboration with Russian energy players as profitable. Some of this has to do also with historical elements about the way in which Gazprom and Russian players portrayed Ukraine as an unreliable partner, and thus a direct collaboration with Gazprom, for example, through Nord Stream 2 as essential. This is also very much related to historical roots, the roots of the very long-term history of Soviet oil and natural gas exports to Western Western Europe. And all of this emphasize the temptation side of this balance, leading us to a situation where after Russia's intervention in Ukraine in 2014, sanctions remained rather lukewarm. Very soon after those sanctions were entered into, there was an unspoken consensus that they were not really reaching many of their goals, so maybe they shouldn't be kept. And what we saw between 2014 and 2022 was actually an increase in Western Europe's dependence on Russian fossil fuels, both in natural gas, in oil, and in coal, that approximately 30% and more of dependency on Russian imports remained or increased. Here, I also want to include the whole set of issues having to do with the tension in European Union policies as European Union. So not for a moment talking about individual states such as Germany, but as European Union. And something that comes out very clearly in the research I did for this book, and something I discuss at length in the book, is how there was a tension, not only between threat and temptation, but a tension between different strands of European Union policy. On the one hand, the strand towards the emphasis on security of supply, especially obviously prompted by the 1973 oil crisis, but also a very important policy trend towards liberalization of markets. Part of this, I would say, was very positive. The idea that you need to change contractual relations so that the natural gas molecule is free to move and is not tied to particular markets, as was in the contractual system prevalent and still partially prevalent. But part of this actually meant the European Union going away from actual support of infrastructure projects, saying, let's leave that to the market. And lo and behold, we are here in 2022 with European Union players wanting to import more liquefied natural gas to move away from dependency on Russia, and not really able to do that because key terminals for the importation of this natural gas in liquid form, such as those in northern Germany, have not been built because the European Union was waiting for private investors and was not willing to support them directly. To this, we need to add decarbonization, which is kind of a third trend that is impacting on European Union policy. It may well be that this geopolitical shift of 2022 is finally going to bring these three elements of EU policy together. That would be wonderful, but that is still an open question. So I want to end my discussion here. I want to thank all of you who have contributed to this project. And if you're interested in energy, I have a Twitter account where I post once in a while. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margarita. I have a few thoughts and questions that I'd like to share with you. And as I do, I'll try to incorporate some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A into the conversation. And again, I'll remind everyone that if you'd like to pose a question or share a thought, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And if you're going to post a question or thought on the live stream, we can make sure that it makes its way into our conversation here. So one question I had is about this story of European diversification. And so European Union leaders announced recently that they thought they could reach their goal of diversifying Europe away from Russian fossil fuels in 5 years' time, which surprised me very much, how quickly they think they might be able to do that. And you mentioned the US-European natural gas deal for US liquefied natural gas making its way into the European markets more fully. Lots of fanfare about that, but it's only 15 BCM, 15 billion cubic meters of gas. And I think Russia exports something like 160-ish billion cubic meters of gas to Europe these days. So that's just a drop in the bucket, isn't it? And then I want to ask David Horgan's question, which he put into the Q&A as part of this overall question about the future of the Russian-European energy relationship. And that is, you mentioned how difficult it would be to just redirect natural gas in particular to East Asia or to China. Could you reflect a little bit more on some of those difficulties and why you think that perhaps China would not be able to take up some of the slack, as it were, and all of this? So 3 big questions, but all interrelated. So is 5 years plausible for European diversification? Isn't 15 billion cubic meters of US liquefied natural gas just symbolic? And what's the future of the Russian-Chinese, Russian-East Asian energy relationship?
Thank you, thank you. You're very much on the money, because when I heard about the European Union plans to move away, I thought that that was overly optimistic. So there are 3 elements of the European Union's policy plan. One is to try to engage new supplies. Maybe that will happen, not only liquefied natural gas, but supplies from other producers. Okay. The second one is to engage renewables more fully, faster. Okay, maybe that can be done with the right financial incentives. The third is to reduce demand. And the key word here was that people were going to turn down their thermostats by 1 degree, I guess, centigrade, Celsius. Now, that's possible, but with climate change and with summers in the European Union getting really steamy, I wonder whether that is realistic, because the idea that air conditioning is not necessary because it's only warm 1 week per year. I say that with a smile because I do a lot of research in Germany, and all my German colleagues said we don't need air conditioning here because it's only hot 2 days a year, and then I'm sweltering because there's no apartments with air conditioning. I think that's going to be harder. I think that's going to be much harder, and I do not think that this is really realistic. If we look, for example, at the way in which the European Union and even Germany have been able to comply with the goals of reducing carbon emissions to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, we know that they have not been successful at all in keeping these commitments. So I am a little bit skeptical about whether that can really happen. There would need to be a lot of incentives. And I also want to emphasize that a reduction in demand will only happen if there is an increase in prices, but an increase in prices also has a political side. And there is a whole discussion in all of Europe now about how consumers are going to be supported so that they do not have to bear the cost of this. But if there is no cost, I don't think there's going to be a real reduction in demand. So that is a very tough question politically as well. Concerning the 15 BCM of US LNG, absolutely, you are very much correct. That's just a drop in the bucket. And they have been trying to bring in other LNG suppliers, Qatar, others, with mixed results. I also wonder, how is the contractual issue going to play here? Because we know that in the standard playbook and in the standard textbook about LNG cargoes sometimes, many times, do not have a fixed price, but may be redirected depending on who is going to pay more. So how are we going to deal with that side of the issue? Also, given the fact that those new terminals will take a couple of years to build as well. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this. And finally, concerning China, those pipelines that are going to bring Russian natural gas to China have largely not been built. So that's not going, that kind of pivot to China will not happen very quickly. So what I think would be interesting to see is how these two sides of the issue play in. So from a purely market and price perspective, the fact that Russia cannot really move those supplies to China so quickly may support Russia in lowering prices or being more flexible in conditions vis-a-vis European consumers. But the whole point was that European consumers wanted to totally get away from Russian natural gas and not to be brought back again into this tempting embrace. So a very interesting combination of factors there.
Absolutely. And maybe I can pose a question about the balance between public policy in Europe and commercial decisions made by firms in the creation of this infrastructure, and indeed the creation of this mutual dependence of Russia's state budget being dependent on European energy markets and Europe being dependent on Russian fossil fuels, and especially natural gas. So there's a reason why these pipelines were built this way and why the LNG terminals were not built, because it's less expensive and more profitable for all of the parties involved to bring the gas from next door in Russia through pipelines. And piped gas tends to be less expensive than liquefied natural gas. And so there are two things that came into my mind when you were talking about this. So one is, are we, do you think, moving away from commercial decision making in the EU-Russia energy relationship toward public policy decision making and geopolitically oriented public policy decision making, since all of the things that the European Union is describing are things that are just more expensive, which then gets back to this question about how much Europe will be willing to tell its firms, sorry, it's going to cost more money to run your factory, and how much Europe will be willing to tell its households, sorry, it's just going to cost more to heat or cool your home or to turn the lights on. Like, are the firms and the households really going to be willing to to pay that geopolitical price for these public policy decisions?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's a really, really key issue, and it's also something you have been working on for many years. So I think you have a lot of insights on this as well. So obviously, the kind of change that we are seeing, or that the European Union is proposing, will only take place if there are decisions made on a public policy level and not at a purely firm level. Because, again, as you said, pipelined in natural gas is cheaper, more efficient, and it's also ecologically more efficient. We often forget about the ecological cost of LNG. To cool natural gas, to make it liquid, you need a lot of energy. To gasify it, you need a lot of energy, but sometimes we forget that to keep it liquid, you also need a lot of energy, because otherwise it will dissipate in the air.
And to ship it too, right? So the carbon footprint of LNG is actually very different, as you point out.
Yes, absolutely. And this, I think, is a little bit of an Achilles heel of US plans concerning LNG, which is obviously the amounts we're talking about here are unprecedented, even if they are a drop in the bucket. But already in the past, there have been this idea that US LNG could, quote unquote, save Europe. But at that time, the question was, who is going to pay the price for this? And I am not so familiar with what are the price agreements for those 15 BCM equivalent of LNG, which the US will supply. But it's really a very, very important question. Now, so yes, to do that, you will need to move away from firm decision making. And I think if you would leave it only to the firms, they will go back to some kind of energy relationship with Russia, because I just need to look back at 2014. But this takes me back to something, a person I admire a lot, and whose book is a key reading for anybody interested in the beginning and the durability of that relationship. I'm referring to Per Hoxelius. He's a Swedish energy historian and historian of technology. He's also a member of my study group in Germany. I have a study group on energy materiality at the Hans Wissenschaftskolleg in Germany, and we meet every 6 months when there's no COVID. Meeting again next month. He has a fantastic book called Red Gas, where he talks about the beginnings of this relationship. If I had more time, we could talk more about how the way that original relationship was created has had a tremendous longevity in terms of attitudes and trust between Russian and Western European players. But the reason I'm mentioning him here is because he posted something on Twitter a month ago saying that he did not believe that Western European households or consumers were willing to pay more to support Ukraine. I think he's had to walk this back a little bit because obviously those changes have been made in policy, in official policy. But I think what he's getting at, and what you're also getting at, is that to maintain this larger scale policy to move away from Russian fossil fuels will imply a very, very clear higher cost. And there's going to be a whole issue of how do you manage this, both in terms of managing attitudes towards the value of Ukraine, of Ukraine's sovereignty versus the value of cheap fossil fuels for your household, and how states are going to manage the issue of subsidies to keep households happy while increasing the prices. But again, this is a contradiction in terms, because if you want to reduce demand, you need to increase prices.
And it's fascinating, and I'm glad you brought up Per's book, Red Gas, which is, I think, a really interesting story about the origins of this. But wouldn't it be such a curious turn of events that the European Soviet and then European Russian natural gas relationship survived decades of the Cold War in the midst of the threat of nuclear annihilation for everyone? And when the Soviets were doing all sorts of nasty things around the world, including to their own citizens, including in Ukraine, that it would be this war in Ukraine that finally perhaps would sever this long-standing relationship, which survived the Cold War. And that this would be the moment, I think is really interesting. Let me.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Oh, I think that is really, really a very important point. At the same time, the fact that it survived the Cold War, the fact that that supply relationship worked so well, there's a wonderful word in Russian, без перебойно, through all those challenges, through the Iron Curtain, that created the brotherhood, the siblinghood, the mutual trust that created the basis for basically the exclusion of Ukraine as a interesting player in the view of those actors.
Absolutely. So there's a question in the chat from Javed Khan about Germany, and I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about Germany's role in this, and maybe as well German firms' role in this, as opposed to Germany the country, or Germany the sovereign government. So there are two. One is the question Javed poses, and one is connected to Nord Stream 2, which you mentioned several times. So Javed was hoping you could speak to the question of Germany's long-standing decision to abandon nuclear power as an alternate source of, power and electricity. And do you think Germany will revisit that question of nuclear power? Do you think that there's a sense of regret in German politics at the moment about having made that decision so long ago, so that they were basically left with coal and gas as the options for generating power, heat, and electricity? And then so that's one question from Javed. And then I have another one about Nord Stream 2, as I mentioned. So Nord Stream 2 is built. It is a pipe sitting at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Cost something like $11 billion to build. It's a joint effort of European energy firms and of Gazprom. It was maybe days or weeks away from being finally permitted by the German regulatory authorities. And since the war began, as you well know, the German regulatory authorities took one step back away from that final permitting. Do you think that this is the end of Nord Stream 2 and that we're going to have this $11 billion pipe sitting at the bottom of the Baltic Sea forever empty? Or will there be some moment in the future as the war ends that the German regulator or Europeans will revisit that question?
Well, thank you for this bringing together these two questions, because both of them get at something that is really important, which is sunk costs, which is you invest on something and then what do you do with that infrastructure? Does the fact that you have the infrastructure there gets you into a kind of technological lock-in? That's one of those words, those phrases that Per Hoxelius likes to use in our meetings, and limits your alternatives. So we know from the case of the German decision to stop relying on nuclear power plants, that decision was followed by a very lengthy judicial process about who would have to pay for those sunk costs, who is responsible for the huge losses incurred by those companies. And I expect that exactly the same is going to happen with Nord Stream 2. So I think lawyers are going to have a field day, because there's going to be a lot of issues concerning this fine print about who is responsible for this. So now going back to the questions. So concerning nuclear power, I think I'm sure that many Germans are rethinking whether that was the right decision in 2011 to do this. But at the same time, we have the question, well, now what would be the cost of restarting these nuclear power plants? And also, what is the time horizon of different infrastructures? Again, this is somewhat related to the issue of materiality I discuss in the book. Because if you restart a nuclear power plant, you cannot really restart it for 5 years. That doesn't make any sense. And then are you going to be locked into using that technology in the longer term? But I do think that there is a very significant rethinking of many, many things going on in Germany. You have a green minister of defense who is saying we need to rearm. So if that is possible, a rethinking of nuclear power plants is possible. Now, concerning Nord Stream 2, again, I think once the dust settles a little bit here, I think there will be, well, first of all, the lawyers are already, I'm sure, somewhere with their business cards, but I think there will be a lot of pressure to move away from sanctions on Russia. There will be a lot of pressure to somehow use this. I am not so familiar with the idea of using it for hydrogen exports. You may know more about this, but I know that some people have discussed this. Again, it will depend on whether dealing with Russia at some point becomes politically correct again. And at this point, obviously, it is not. But I think there's many actors waiting under the radar to do business with Russia. Even things as simple as what is happening with the Russian stock market. People waiting to buy some of those assets at higher prices tells me that as soon as there is a little bit of a let go, as soon as there is some kind of durable agreement, actors are going to be willing to revisit that question.
Thank you. So Jay Wilberforce has put a question in the chat about the American side of the LNG possibilities. So you mentioned on the European side, we would need regasification terminals in places where they are not right now. And on the American side, Jay is wondering whether there are significant enough regulatory and political social obstacles to building enough liquefaction capacity in order to send more than 15 BCM of natural gas to Europe. And that made me wonder, and so maybe I'll add a follow-up question to Jay's as well. It made me wonder, the beauty of liquefying natural gas is that you can sell it to whomever you want. That's different from, it is the defining difference between that and piped gas. And so LNG markets tend to resemble a bit more oil markets, which is they just go out on the market and whoever pays most for it gets it. So should we imagine that American exporters, private American exporters of liquefied natural gas should be promising their exports to Europe, even if Europe is not the highest paying purchaser of that LNG, right? So it's one thing for the president of the United States to say, we're going to send some liquefied natural gas, but he doesn't own it. And so if Europe wants it, it's going to have to pay more than other entities for it. And so have you given any thought to those commercial dynamics of what might be this explosion? Well, that's the wrong metaphor when we're talking about energy, but this putatively massive increase in LNG exports to Europe.
Well, thank you so much for bringing the question in this form, because it really highlights kind of something really important, which is, yes, you need the infrastructure. To build the infrastructure, sometimes you need state support in the form of investment guarantees, for example, and that's one reason why Europe hasn't built as many of those terminals. I do not see too many problems with perhaps the US offering investment guarantees to build that infrastructure for larger scale exports. But as you very, very correctly point out, that's only one part of the question. The question of, can the state tell you who to sell to? That may fly, that may fly in some European country. That's not going to fly here. I do not imagine how this could happen. All I could imagine would be some situation where the US would fund some kind of price support mechanism that would maybe support higher prices or a price guarantee for selling to Europe. But then how do you bring in the European players in terms of pricing? Do you use any kind of wartime state powers to tell producers, you have to sell, we will pay you this price, which is a good price, but you have to sell it? I think those are very difficult questions in an American setting. So that's a huge challenge, and that's very good that you have brought that up.
Well, and that would also mean in that case that US taxpayers would be subsidizing the LNG consumption of European citizens, which is also difficult to imagine politically. So I think we have time for one more question, and I wanted to come back to the combination of two facts. So one, there's still gas flowing through the Ukrainian transit pipe. Russian gas to Europe still going through Ukraine right now. And you mentioned how much Ukraine earns from that, but also the geopolitical importance of the fact that Ukraine is an important transit corridor between Russia and Europe. At the same time, Ukrainian officials have been demanding almost that Europeans stop buying Russian fossil fuels. Do you think that there's a risk on the Ukrainian side of Ukraine getting what it wishes for? Because if it were true that all of a sudden Europe stopped buying Russian natural gas, then there wouldn't be any natural gas flowing through Ukraine, and then they wouldn't earn the transit fees, nor would they have that really important geopolitical place in the energy chain. So do you think they've thought this all the way through, or they're really willing to give up both the returns and that place in the energy chain?
That's a really good point. I think if you had asked me this question before February 24th, I would have said that Ukraine needs to be thinking very hard about what's going to happen in a decarbonization world where those flows are not going to be so important. And in a sense, I think Ukraine was betting to the wrong horse, trying to maintaining that huge role in natural gas transit. So what is happening now, I think, if Ukraine is successful in lobbying Western Europe to reduce those imports, that will affect Ukraine. But at this moment, the existential threat to Ukraine, represented by the Russian invasion, by the Russian all-in attack on its cities and population, I think is more significant than the potential security or even economic impact of the pipeline. So I think, given that choice, I think I can understand that they would prefer to go with using a European move away from reliance on Russian fossil fuels, rather than staying in this unstable political situation and maintaining transit.
And so maybe one last quick question. I think we have like 2 minutes left. Do you think on the Russian side, in the energy industry or in government, there has been a lot of surprise about how politicized energy exports from Russia to Europe have become, given this long Soviet history when they were essentially never really politicized? That the energy sector was sort of carved out from geopolitics, and now it's definitely not. Do you think there's surprise that all of a sudden the Europeans are taking seriously the possibility of a rapid transition away from fossil fuels?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because if you look at the entire decades since the 1980s, that was a very, very different relationship, a very different level of trust. And I think it came at a total surprise. But I would like to end by saying that given all that has happened, I myself ask myself every day, were those relationships really depoliticized, or simply it was an unspoken politicization? Because there was an inherent set of assumptions about politics that was there. I don't have a clear answer to this, but I asked myself whether it was really depoliticized or not, and probably many Ukrainians will tell you that it wasn't.
Right, absolutely. Well, Margarita, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and I'm sure that many of our viewers and listeners will be eager to read your book. It's a wonderful piece of work, and I'm grateful to you that you had the time to share some of the thoughts about it in its own right, but also as it connects to the unfolding tragedy in Ukraine. So looking forward to seeing you at the Davis Center again very soon. And for everyone, I hope you stay well and safe.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the inspiration and for the chance to